Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is My New York. It may soon be legal to bet on any sporting event or any part of it, from Little League games up to the pros. From a bet on the NFL coin flip to whether a pitcher's next toss will be a curveball or a splitter. The Supreme Court opened the door to legal sports betting nationwide last May. A gold rush of new betting opportunities is forecast. Veteran sports business consultant Marc Ganis told me he is worried about likely unintended consequences of sports betting, and he explained the court's ruling.
The ruling basically said that a law that was passed by Congress many years ago,
The Bradley Law.
The Bradley Law, that said that there were
Bill
only
Bradley.
a certain number of states, great shooter from Princeton and the New York Knicks,
Right.
that only a certain number of states, and listed those states, could be involved in sports gambling, sports betting. And and each of those states had their own restrictions on it. And it was because the federal government wanted to not have sports gambling. Some of this was related to the NCAA and collegiate activity, but they didn't want to have sports gambling. But there were already some states that were engaged in sports gambling, the most famous being Nevada. And what the Supreme Court decision said is that's not constitutional.
Yeah.
Which means all states can have sports gambling. Since the federal government allowed it for 7, all states can have it.
What are we talking about here? This looks like an enormous gold rush.
Well, what's going on right now is, rather than a gold rush, it's a lobbyists' rush, because there is so much going on in the state house level that gambling interests, primarily the existing gambling interests, and then some fantasy football type of companies, and even some internet companies, are trying to get legislation in individual states to their liking. And so they're paying lobbyists a lot of money. Right now, the people making the most money are lobbyists and lawyers. Figure that.
They always do.
They always do. Doesn't it seem that way? And then there's another big battle going on in Washington, because the leagues want national legislation. They want there to be national legislation so that it's not each one of 50 states. It's basically the wild, wild west, and each one can pick and choose what they want to do to try and gain more business. And so what they would like is national legislation that addresses a number of things: consumer protection, payment for the intellectual property that the leagues own, some kind of integrity aspects to everything, whether it's the NBA and Major League Baseball have asked for an integrity fee, the NFL has not, but something related to the integrity of the game and recoupment of the costs associated with that.
What you're saying raises, almost everything you say raises a question in my mind. Consumer protection, what does that mean?
Oh my goodness. Consumer protection is everything from transparency, fairness, the monies that get paid out, if there are pools that are part of the gambling or proposition bets, that people who are on the inside, who are actually processing them, don't wait and see how the bets have come in and then give themselves an advantage. And you might say, well, no one would ever do that. That's actually exactly what happened with the daily fantasy companies a couple of years ago that really caused them problems. They were hiring people who understand these things very well, for a very small amount of money. But what they were doing was they were waiting to see how the bets came in from the people around the country, around the world, and then finding those anomalies for them where they could make the most money. And what the studies came out and said a very small percentage of people actually wound up winning a very large percentage of the money. That doesn't just happen.
Intellectual property, would that include the official statistics that the NBA puts out, or the NFL or MLB?
Some years ago, and you may still have a pager, I don't, but I do have a BlackBerry. Some years ago, there was a big court case that went to the Supreme Court. It had to do with scores being sent on pagers. And the Supreme Court determined that there is news to some of this information, and that news, therefore, is public domain news. And so some of that cannot be restricted. But the team names, the team logos, the player likenesses, video, anything that is not just a news aspect, that is owned by the leagues, and they do have rights to that intellectual property.
All right. It sounds very complicated to me. I'm not a gambler or in this business. Can this, in fact, be regulated? Can we set standards and hope that the unintended consequences aren't lethal?
Tony, it must be regulated. There really is not a choice here. If it's not regulated, then anybody on a street corner can start taking bets and never pay them off if somebody wins, or can go through whatever process they want to collect money from people that lose. There are just so many ways in which manipulation, bad experiences, one way or the other, can occur. It must be regulated. But make no mistake about it, there will be unintended consequences. There just will be. It's the nature of the beast. Look at Colorado and the marijuana law. One of the reasons that they passed in Colorado, passed legalized marijuana, was they said they wanted to shrink the illegal drug sales of pot in Colorado. Here's the unintended consequence. They've actually exponentially expanded illegal pot sales in Colorado. Why? Because the regulated side has taxes, locations you can buy it from, health standards, things of that nature. But when you're out smoking, the cops don't know if it was bought from a store or bought from somebody on a street corner. So what has happened is, because there's now a price difference and a convenience difference, but yet there's no risk, legal risk, it's now caused the illegal sale to explode in Colorado, an unintended consequence. We may see something similar happen here. The more we regulate, which is needed, the more it creates a potential competitive advantage for the unregulated. Again, very similar to pot in Colorado. And we may see an explosion in unregulated illegal gambling as a result. People will disagree on that. There's some people say, well, even if that happens, we'll see lines move because we'll have all this, and we'll see if somebody's trying to manipulate games. We'll see. But that there will be more illegal gambling is almost a certainty. Then you've got another question. Are we talking about location-based gambling, or are we talking about internet-based gambling?
Well, I read today, in fact, that in New Jersey, FanDuel has announced it's going to set up a sports betting operation and also an internet casino. I'm talking about location, internet casino.
Yeah, well, you're now raising that announcement in a relatively unregulated industry, which right now it is without federal regulation. People can say whatever they want to say they're going to do. And don't forget, a lot of these companies are trying to raise money at this moment, and that's part of the wild, wild west. It's the financial side of it, where they're going to private equity firms, who are going to big money parties, from funds to institutional investors to high net worth individuals, saying, look at our projections, look at all this money we're going to take in, look how big the size of the market is. And they're getting a lot of money coming in, some stupid money, maybe some smart money coming in. But how do you raise the money? By making it appear like you're ahead of everybody, that you've got a competitive advantage. Like you have a press release in New Jersey announcing this. Is it actually operating? Probably not yet. But Tony Guida just talked about it on the news, and therefore maybe that'll help get credibility as they do fundraising. I'm not disparaging it. It's just part of life.
Understood.
But it is part of the unintended consequence.
What you're describing here seems to me like, to use a figure from mythology, a hydra, a many-headed monster that states and the federal government are trying to wrestle to at least to a draw.
Let me give you a different one, Medusa, because Medusa was beautiful but had the many snakes on her head, and if you looked at it, you turned to stone.
Yeah.
But Medusa was beautiful, and that's what the attraction was. That's what's going on here. It's beautiful. It has the potential to bring a lot of money in. It has the potential to create some positive experiences for many fans associated with it. It has the potential to bring tax revenue in. It's beautiful, isn't it? Well, let's see if it turns out to be Medusa.
Could be fatal too. I asked you at the beginning. Let me ask you again. You talk about the potential and the size of this, the money. What are we talking about here? This is
really depends on who you ask. If you talk to some parties that are more conservative about it, it's good money. It's in the billions, but it's not it's not going to set the world on fire. And then you talk to others, and they say, you add internet gaming to this, so that you can make a bet. You can be sitting in the stadium and make a prop bet. You can have what's the next play going to be, and you can make a bet on your iPhone or your Android device, or you can do it from your living room, and you can do it while the game's going on. It's like, whoa, what's that market? Nobody knows how large the market is right now.
I saw one figure, and just to speak to this, nobody does know, but I mean, maybe you can interpret this. The American Gaming Association recently figured that illegal betting in a recent year, I guess, was $150 billion. That's illegal betting. So if we have legal betting,
it'd be multiples of that. If we have legal betting, it'll be multiples of that. Now, recognize that when they talk about 150 billion, the amount of new money that represents, meaning money that's not recirculated, that was won and then rebet kind of thing, is a much smaller number. Take if I don't know if you go to casinos, but let's say you go to a blackjack table, and you get $100 in chips. You're replaying those chips many times as you win, as you lose, as you win. So your turnover could be thousands, but you actually only put $100 on the table.
Right.
That's the same with a number like 150 billion.
Just to close the loop on all this stuff that's going on in the states and in the federal government, do you see a deadline in the offing? Do you see Congress getting this done by when?
Congress needs to get ahead of this rather than play behind on the states, because if they don't, they may wind up getting lawsuits by the states afterwards saying we should be grandfathered in. They need to do this quickly. Senator Hatch, the chairman of the applicable committee, said that he was planning on having legislation within months after the Supreme Court decision came out. So you're probably looking at this fall to have legislation. But there's a battle onto what the legislation will be. The states don't want as much federal regulation. The leagues and the intellectual property owners that are going to be bet on in the first place do want federal legislation. The gaming institutions, they unless they can have a lot of influence in federal legislation, they'd rather fight it out on a state-by-state basis, because that's what they've been doing very successfully with all the states that now have casino gaming in them. So this is a game they know to play very, very well and have the resources to play it well. Then you've got the internet companies that want it to be as loosey-goosey as possible. And then you've got the other question of offshore and what happens with if the websites are offshore rather than onshore. And does the federal government say you can't use credit cards or the banking system for it, which they can for anything offshore, because how do you regulate that? It's really a thorny issue, lots of thorns in it. There is I've spoken with team owners and league executives who have a very positive view of this. They see it as basically a holy grail of sorts, economically, fan engagement related, and it very well may be that. But there are so many parties that are involved in its oversight that they need to get their arms around it. And as things stand right now, that's not the case.
Let's talk about the leagues. They seem to have different opinions on this. The NBA came out early, even before, I think, the Supreme Court ruled. Adam Silver was saying betting is a good idea.
Absolutely.
The NFL, you've talked many times with Roger Goodell, MLB. Just give us a thumbnail description of what's going on with the league.
Well, there is a commonality among them, which is federal legislation, comprehensive federal legislation is needed. So they are all in agreement on that particular issue. They don't want to be fighting it on a state-by-state basis. They don't want to be fighting lobbyists or hiring lobbyists on a state-by-state basis. Plus, their fans are all over the country. Will one set of fans in one state be treated differently than another set of fans in another? So they would like as much of this incorporated within federal legislation as possible. That's a commonality. Distinctions, embracing of it. There are the NBA through Adam, and let me say, stipulate up front, Adam Silver is one of the smartest guys I know and much smarter than I am. We do have a bit of a divergence on this, because I worry about killing the goose that laid the golden egg perhaps a little more than others do.
How do you kill the goose?
Oh, by having either the perception or the actuality of players or referees or coaches changing the outcome of games.
Well,
and it has happened.
Yes, we saw referees not so long ago in the NBA who were...
He was betting on games.
He was betting.
So there wasn't an accusation that he threw any games or changed any games, but that he had interaction with known gamblers and people who took bets, and he was a gambler himself.
Well, this takes us to a question I want to ask, which is, I mean, the effect of this on players, professional and amateur, I would think is maybe more profound with the college folks, athletes who aren't paid, than the pros who are paid very well.
Tony, that's one of the big issues here. The NCAA is going to have a devil of a time with compliance, because who's to say that a player who missed some shots in a game or didn't hold on to a ball in the end zone, fumbled a ball when he got hit? That's what happens normally in games. But what if it changes the result? What if there were lines that moved and all of a sudden that kind of thing happens? Is it fair to accuse the player? I don't think so, without evidence, but it's going to happen anyway. And then what about players who are susceptible, who are coming from impoverished backgrounds, especially in college, impoverished backgrounds, and somebody comes and offers them so much money to do this or that? The coach is making millions of dollars. The university is making millions of dollars. The networks are making millions of dollars. The players make nothing. How does every one of them turn it down just based on ethics and morality? In this day and age, ethics and morality seems to have taken a back seat to outrage and personal desire.
And greed.
Yeah, well, that too. So how do you say no?
Well, you make the point. It's very well that it's not only the possibility of shaving points or dropping a ball or whatever, but the perception. Even if nothing has been done wrong.
Tony, that could be as damaging as the reality, because if the fans believe right now, a player in the NFL can have a ball in his hands in the end zone and drops it, and they say he just lost concentration, he lost focus, he heard footsteps. Nobody's saying he was on the take because there was it changed the line from this to that. This side of the bet won it and this side lost it, and it switched around. Nobody's saying that right now, even with $150 billion of illegal wagering that they say goes on in NFL games. Nobody's really talking like that. But when you have tens of millions of fans who are betting $20 and $30, and that happens, you know what they're going to say. They're going to say, oh, somebody got to him. He did that on purpose. And
the argument that guy is making $20 million and therefore wouldn't do that, not really going to fly, is it?
First, there are very few of them making $20 million.
Yeah, right.
But point being, you've got
45
players on the field, 8 or 9 of them are making the big money. How about an offensive lineman who just happens to trip over his feet on a key play and the quarterback gets sacked? There are just so many ways that fans are going to start saying, oh, look at that. Look at what that guy did. Look at what that guy did. Without it being big money, whether it's in college or the pros, but college is a much bigger issue.
Do we have to pay? Is it going to lead to paying college athletes, or would that even be a deterrent?
Think about it. Is it a deterrent? It's
probably not.
I don't know that it is, because how much could you possibly pay the college players? Let's go on the pros. What if it's not money? What if it has something to do with blackmail or having something on a player, or what if a player did or could get accused of spousal abuse or something like that? What's to happen? How do you know? And that gets to questions of privacy now for the players. Are the players who would get, in the professionals, get half of the additional money that comes in? Because that's roughly what they get in the NBA and the NFL. They get roughly half of all the money.
So everybody, I think we need to make that point. Everybody gets a piece of this.
Oh, yeah.
The leagues are going to be selling what, information and their stats?
No one knows yet. No one knows yet where the leagues are going to make their money. In NBA, Major League Baseball, they said they wanted a 1% integrity fee on everything, and that would have been a source of funds on every dollar bet. The NFL has not been in favor of that. But that would have been a source. But is there going to be a lot of money? Is there going to be a huge amount of money coming from intellectual property? Let's see what the federal legislation says. Is there going to be a fee, integrity fee or other kind of fee? Let's see what the federal legislation says. Is there going to be some big increase in broadcast revenues? We don't know that yet.
Yeah, the networks are going to make money, we assume.
Well, if the networks make big money on sports betting advertising, then they will pass some of that on to the leagues.
Right.
And then whatever goes to the leagues, the players get half of.
So the broadcasters presumably are going to get a piece of this. Mm-hmm. The leagues are going to get a piece of this. The players, as you point out, because by their contracts that exist now, they get roughly 50% of the revenue of the league. They're going to get a piece of this.
Right.
Everybody's going to get a piece of this. So this is it's going to be a gold rush? I mean, it
depends on who you talk to. I know people who say they still don't know where the big money is that would be coming in, and others that say that there's inevitable that there'll be big money coming in. You know, think of English Premier League soccer, where gambling is legal in England. What's their big source of revenue from gambling? It's sports gambling. It's on sponsorships. A lot of the kits, as they call them, the uniforms, have advertising on the front of them. Some of them are from banks and insurance companies, but a whole bunch of the smaller division soccer teams there, the less popular ones, it's a gaming institution. Almost all of the EPL teams have got signage of the gambling houses. So the potential is that there's going to be sponsorship money. That's a reality. I would expect sponsorship money will come in. But is there going to be some big fee or some big increase in intellectual property rights? People don't know that yet because there has been legislation. Nothing's been negotiated. Will there be a big competition for commercial time? So therefore, like when we had 2 years where FanDuel and DraftKings generated a lot of private equity money, and they poured that into advertising on ESPN and NBC Sports and ABC Sports and sponsorships with the teams. That's likely to happen, but that gravy train ran out after 2 years. Will it be short term or will it be long term? Mm-hmm. These are questions that people don't have answers to yet. It's still an unknown. There are projections, but there are projections that are modest and projections that are shooting the moon. And people don't know where it's going to be yet. This
Medusa is going to, as you put it, a wonderful allusion to mythology. It sounds like you're more worried that this thing is, this beautiful looking, shining star on a hill is going to have a lot of fatal consequences.
I am certain that there will be unintended consequences that will be negative. How extensive they are, how they're dealt with, how the fans perceive it are unknowns right now. But there absolutely will be adverse unintended consequences, just as there absolutely will be enhanced revenue and enhanced fan engagement. The proportions of those and how extensive each of those are unknowns right now.
And what is the likelihood, to use another analogy, that these holes in the dam can be plugged once we figure out what they are, these unintended consequences?
It depends on how bad they get. If the fans feel that games are being thrown, if there's evidence, reality, not just perception, of it happening a few times, it will be very hard to gain the perception of integrity back. One of the things the NFL has, one of the reasons the NFL is gambled on more than any other sport, is because there is a rock-solid belief among professional gamblers to the people just watching, at home, that the games are on the up and up. Final score is always on the up and up. Every play is on the up and up in the NFL. They spend a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of oversight to make sure that that is the case because they had their own gambling problems in the 60s.
But if this raises doubts about that, does it have the potential, Mark, to destroy these professional sports?
You know, there was a time when the WWE was called the World Wrestling Federation, and there were actually people who believed it was real, when it never was. Now it's just called sports entertainment. My greatest concern is that there are enough isolated cases of issues that cause people to start viewing it as sports entertainment rather than sports competitions. It won't take many. It just won't take many. And the leagues have got to be on top of it. The players and the referees have got to be willing to have some invasion of their privacy, more than it is today. I mean, today you take their urine, you take their blood, but you may have to start looking at their behavior and their associations more than we do today. Will they be comfortable with that? I don't know. Will their permission be needed for it? Probably, in some sort of collective bargaining agreement. Is it going to be a big issue come a CBA time? Probably. Many of these things can be dealt with if everybody works together in a cooperative way, and that includes the legislators, that includes the politicians. But right now the politicians are being pulled in other directions by moneyed interests. So I don't know how that will end up.
Well, it sounds like once this is done in Congress and we have a season of football, hockey, basketball, baseball, we got to meet up again and find out where we are and what hath gambling wrought.
Give it about 2 or 3 seasons, because this is the kind of thing that will be built up. There are ways to make this a positive, but I'm not sure that the greed aspect of it by parties, not the leagues and not the players, will allow that to happen in the way it could happen. And that's where my biggest concern comes in. It's not with the leagues, it's not with the players, it's not with the referees, it's not with the coaches, but it's with those moneyed interests that are looking at this as a way to make big money off of somebody else's back and really don't care what the unintended consequences are.
Of course. Marc Ganis's Periscope on the perilous waters of legal sports betting is the first part of our closer look at this issue. Next week, we will descend to the rings of hell beneath sports betting, the little-known and much misunderstood problem of compulsive gambling. Hope to see you then.